It started with a flicker, a subtle shift in the familiar silver light that blankets our world after the sun has gone to sleep. At first, no one really noticed. Why would they? The moon has always been there, a silent, dependable companion hanging in the vast, star-dusted darkness. It was the poet's muse, the lover's lamppost, the constant in a world of endless change. We took its gentle presence for granted, assuming it would forever remain a cold, dead rock, reflecting a light that wasn't its own. We were so very, very wrong. We never thought to question its stillness, its perfect, unwavering silence. Then the whispers began. Not audible whispers, but a feeling. A strange prickling sensation on the back of the neck when you stepped outside after dark. People would look up, squinting at the lunar sphere, and feel a deep, unexplainable unease settling in their bones. The glow seemed different. It wasn't the soft, ethereal white we all knew. It had a new quality, a strange, almost sickly luminescence that painted the streets and rooftops in unsettling shades of pale green and violet. It felt like the light from a dream you couldn't quite remember, a dream that left you feeling cold and watched long after you woke up. Astronomers were the first to voice their confusion, their calm, academic language barely concealing a growing tremor of fear. Their powerful telescopes, which had mapped every crater and valley on the lunar surface 1,000,000 times over, were now showing them the impossible. The familiar patterns of gray and white were slowly, almost imperceptibly, rearranging themselves. The sea of tranquility seemed to ripple, not with water but with something else entirely, something that moved with a purpose that was ancient and unknowable. The scientific community tried to offer explanations, atmospheric distortions, equipment malfunctions, but they knew. Deep down, they knew something fundamental about our reality was breaking apart. That's when the animals started to act strangely. Dogs that once barked at passing cars now stood silent in backyards, their heads cocked towards the sky, letting out low, mournful whimpers that chilled their owners to the core. Flocks of birds would suddenly take flight in the middle of the night, circling in chaotic, panicked patterns against the backdrop of the weirdly glowing orb. They could sense it before we could truly accept it. They understood the change in the sky was not a celestial wonder, it was a warning, a silent, screaming alarm that the oldest thing we knew was no longer sleeping. The change accelerated. What began as a subtle shift in light and a vague sense of unease soon became an undeniable, terrifying transformation. The moon was no longer a sphere of rock, it was becoming something else. A great cosmic eyelid, slowly peeling open after eons of slumber. A vast dark fissure appeared across its center, a crack that widened with each passing night. It wasn't a crater or a canyon, it was a pupil. A colossal, unblinking pupil that stared down at the earth with an ancient, cold intelligence that we could not begin to comprehend. The world watched, frozen, in a collective state of shock and horror. Imagine looking up at the sky you have known your entire life, and seeing an eye looking back. Not a friendly eye, not a curious eye, but a vast, indifferent, and profoundly alien eye. The news channels ran constant coverage, their broadcasts filled with shaky footage and the panicked voices of experts who had no expertise in this. Religions fractured, some proclaiming it a sign of salvation, others a harbinger of the final apocalypse. But for most people it was simpler and far more terrifying than that. It was the feeling of a bug realizing it is being observed through a magnifying glass just before the heat begins to burn. The light it cast was no longer just a strange color, it felt alive. It seeped through windows and under doors, carrying with it a silent pressure that made sleep impossible for millions. When you stood in its gaze, you felt naked, exposed. It was as if this new lunar entity could see right through your skin, right through your skull, and into the messy, frightened thoughts swirling within your mind. It knew your secrets. It knew your fears. It didn't care about them, but it saw them all the same, laid bare under its immense, silent scrutiny. The constant observation was a new kind of psychological torture. The world's governments, with all their power and all their weapons, were rendered utterly impotent. What could they do? Fire missiles at the moon? It was a laughable, pathetic notion. We were children throwing pebbles at a god. We had always looked to the stars with a sense of wonder and a touch of arrogance, believing we were on the verge of conquering the cosmos. But we had never considered that the cosmos might have its own consciousness, its own agenda, and that we were nothing more than an interesting pattern of lights on a little blue marble it had just noticed. With the moon's awakening came the dreams, or perhaps they were not dreams at all. They felt more like transmissions, unwanted messages being beamed directly into our sleeping minds. People everywhere reported having the same unsettling visions. They dreamt of vast empty cities built from a dark glassy material with impossible architecture that twisted and turned in defiance of gravity. They dreamt of floating through an endless silent void, feeling a loneliness so profound it was a physical ache. These were not the narratives of our own subconscious, they were echoes from somewhere else, fragments of a consciousness too large for us to hold. The waking world became just as strange. The nights were no longer a time for rest, they were a time of deep and abiding fear. Shadows seemed to stretch and writhe in the moonlight, taking on shapes that flickered at the edge of vision. People would swear they saw movement where there was none, catching glimpses of tall, slender figures silhouetted against the lunar glow, only for them to vanish the moment they turned their heads. Was it mass hysteria, a planet-wide panic attack? Or was the veil between worlds growing thin, frayed by the gaze of the awakened eye in our sky? Children were particularly affected. Their minds, more open and less grounded in the rigid reality of adults, seemed to be more receptive to the moon's influence. They would wake up in the middle of the night not screaming but sitting upright in their beds, staring out their windows with blank, empty eyes. They would speak in monotone voices about the man in the rock who was finally waking up. They drew pictures in crayon, not of houses and suns but of a cracked and watching moon, with strange, spindly creatures crawling out from its fissures and making their way down to Earth. The world's rhythm was broken. Productivity plummeted as entire populations suffered from sleep deprivation and a creeping, ever-present anxiety. People stopped going out after sunset, huddling in their homes with the curtains drawn tight, as if a thin piece of fabric could protect them from the cosmic horror hanging just outside. But there was no escape. Even in the deepest, most windowless room, you could feel it. A low, sub-audible hum that vibrated in your teeth. A constant reminder that we were being watched. Always. The watcher in the sky was patient, and it was changing everything. The final stage of the transformation was the most terrifying. The moon began to whisper. Not in dreams, not through a feeling, but with an actual sound. It was a low, resonant hum that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was the sound of 1 billion tons of rock shifting, of ancient dust stirring, of a cosmic being stretching its limbs after an impossibly long nap. The sound vibrated in the air, in the ground, in our very bones. It was a frequency of pure dread, a sound that bypassed the ears and settled deep within the soul, extinguishing hope and planting the seeds of madness. This new, audible presence shattered the last vestiges of normalcy. People could no longer pretend it wasn't happening. They couldn't hide from a sound that was inescapable. Some were driven to madness by the constant low thrumming, their minds unable to cope with the sensory invasion. Others fell into a strange, trance-like state, drawn out into the open, their faces tilted up towards the watching eye, in a bizarre form of worship. They would stand for hours in the eerie light, motionless, as if listening to instructions that no one else could hear. They were the first to answer its silent call. What does it want? That is the question that now hangs over our broken world, more imposing than the moon itself. There has been no communication, no ultimatum, no grand celestial declaration. There is only the watching, the humming, and the slow creeping changes to our world. Is this an invasion, an observation, or is it something far stranger, something for which our languages have no words? Perhaps we are not the subjects of its attention at all. Perhaps we are merely the incidental life forms living on a thing it desires, like ants on a picnic blanket about to be shaken off. Today is June 13th, 2025. The sun rose this morning, but its light felt weak, temporary. We all know what is waiting for us when it sets again. The true ruler of our world is the one that governs the night. The moon is awake now. It hangs in our sky, a broken and watching God, and we, the 7 billion inhabitants of this fragile planet, can do nothing but wait. We wait for its next move, we wait for it to blink, we wait for the night to fall, and we wonder what new horrors it will bring. The silence is over, the stillness is gone, and we are so afraid of what comes next.